Here in Lansing, Michigan. You're listening to the Lansing Online News Radio show with Bonnie Bucqueroux and Bill Castanier. And on a chilly spring evening here in March in Michigan, we are joined this evening with Valerie Marvin from the Historical Society of Greater Lansing, and she's going to tell us about some really important letters that the community is going to get to hear about.
On Thursday evening, we are going to be joined by Mary Jane Wilson, who is a longtime local historian and Lansing resident, who's going to be sharing with us some of the letters that her father wrote when he served during World War I. This is part of our ongoing program with our current Lansing Goes to War exhibit that's in City Hall, which looks at the role that men and women from the Lansing area have played during times of war, starting with the Civil War and going through Desert Storm. And one of the points we try to make with the exhibit is when most of us think of someone going off to war, they imagine someone putting on a uniform and grabbing a weapon and going out to the front line to fight. But that's not how it works. It takes many different men and women doing many different things to actually help an army tick along during wartime. And Mary Jane's father is a perfect example of that. He was from the Lansing area, born and raised Langsburg, St. John's, and that part of the world. And he was bitten by auto fever as a young man and ended up in the Detroit area, in Ann Arbor, working as a mechanic, selling cars, used cars. And then he tried to enlist as a medic during World War I. Didn't pass the health examination, but then when they put out a call for mechanics to go, and of course Detroit's the place to go if you want mechanics, they were using Model Ts that had been modified actually into ambulances because they were so resilient, and they were shipping thousands of these things over to France, and with it they shipped several hundred mechanics actually, most of which came from the Detroit area. And this time he was given the green light to go ahead, and he set sail for France and was in France through the armistice and actually through negotiations, came back, ended up moving to Lansing and opening a Packard dealership, which eventually turned into a Cadillac dealership. And I dare say there are many people still in Lansing today who remember Mcclintock Cadillac. This was Freeman Mcclintock that we're talking about.
Wow.
And his letters were kept over the years. He sent a series of letters home to his mother. His father had just passed away, so he and his brother were sort of looking after mom, if you will. And he writes a lot about making sure his army pay is getting to mom and making sure she's making the mortgage payments on the farm and that everything's going all right. And the letters were preserved in the family. And Mary Jane is actually going to be coming and reading some of those letters so we can learn more about her father's experience.
They were actually collected in a book as well?
She has written a book that is about her father. It's called In His Words, The Freeman H. Mcclintock Story. And in it she includes the text of several letters that really chart his travel. He starts off December 25th, 1917. Dear Mother, I am now in Mechanical Unit Repair 315 at Camp Hill. This is Christmas Day and I am a long way from home. He closes the letter saying I could use some heavy wool socks and also my heavy union suits, please. Love, Freeman.
With the drop drawer in the back. Yes, I remember those.
He ends up in France not too long later. He sends a letter home the following April 8th. Describing a town that he is in that has about 40,000 people. He said it's very pretty, the prices are cheap, eggs are 54 cents a dozen, bread is scarce and so is sugar. Their wine rooms correspond to our ice cream parlors.
Ooh, wow.
Later in the letters, he writes how he's rather disgusted to hear that this prohibition business sounds like it's really getting some legs. And what are you doing back in the States?
Get out there and march against, yes.
He also writes some letters that really talk about the tragedies that he's seeing. June 6th of 1918, he says, we moved about 125 miles since I wrote last. On the way we met hundreds of poor refugees fleeing from their homes because of the German advance. It's pretty hard to see them as all they have in the world is loaded on carts, wagons, etc. And you realize that as much as he was not pointing a gun, he was in the middle of the war zone.
Yeah.
He was seeing refugees. His work on ambulances, on cars, meant that he was seeing some pretty gruesome things. But that's not always what one writes home about. It's interesting what we choose to share and what we do not share. And while he does talk about refugees, he does talk about seeing parts of the French countryside that are just scorched and destroyed. I have to think there were other things he probably didn't want to burden his mother with. as he was writing home.
I think we think that the soldiers from World Wars I and II often didn't share that much with families even when they got home.
That's very true. There's a sort of, and I think this exists somewhat still today. Of course, we were much more removed, though, from wartime. We were not Skyping in with our loved ones, and we were not seeing, pictures posted on Facebook and Instagram and so on right away. But there's sort of, it's interesting because if you talk to veterans, they'll talk to one another and they'll share stories, and certainly thus you have the growth of things like the VFW and the 40 and 8 and so on. But many of them are very reluctant to share stories with someone else because it's just so hard. And for those of us who've never been to the war front, it's hard to even really, I think, understand what they're saying when they relate some of those experiences.
Other things you'd like to share from his letters?
Well, there were a couple other things that I thought were interesting. He talks a little bit about the armistice in November of 1818. He talks about being greeted by some French civilians. These were the first Americans they had ever seen. And he talks about, they asked initially if they're English, and they said when we told them we were American, they went wild. It was their first day free from the German atrocities. Old men would look at us and talk with bowed heads, and women and children looked at us as if we were something sacred. Interestingly,
that was a brutal war. I mean, we don't remember it at all. We never talk about it.
And he talks in here about being exposed to gas for the first
time.
Really? He talks about seeing machine guns fire. It's absolutely terrible things. But interestingly, he ends up back in Paris at the end of the war, and he writes on January 27th of 1919, "Dear Mother, I'm still in Paris in command of the repair shop and am now more than busy with the peace party here. I have to give both President Wilson and General Pershing's cars my personal attention. One of them has a car in the shop most of the time. Besides that, Herbert Hoover, Colonel House, and Secretary of State Lansing all have cars in Paris, and it keeps us going most of the time." So he's actually in charge of the garage at the end of the war where these cars are being kept for the top American officials who are coming in for the diplomatic talks. And it's pretty amazing. This farm boy from mid-Michigan, who is part of this incredibly significant moment in 20th century American history, he, as I said, the family preserved these letters. He shared his story with his children over the years, and Mary Jane is going to share it with us.
That's going to be a powerful session, I would think.
I think so.
One of the other things, during April, the Historical Society is going to do a dramatic reading of letters from a Civil War soldier home. 63 letters, and his are a little bit more grim in places. We don't have the woman's letters back, but it'll be a dramatic reading of his letters to her, where he becomes more, let's say, familiar with her throughout the war, not having seen her, and they end up being married at the end of the war.
Oh, really?
Yes.
So he courts her through the letters?
Yes.
He does.
Oh.
At the beginning of the letters, he's telling her basically to be a good girl and behave for the teacher.
She's a little young. As soon as you get out of kindergarten.
People got married younger then, Bonnie.
They did, yes, they did. Mm-hmm.
And it reminds us that when we go off to war, we're not in a complete vacuum. We want those ties with home. We need the people we love to stay in communication with us and keep us going. And it was these letters that tied us here in Lansing to these folks that were flung across the world.
You also noted that he was now a member of Mr. Mcclintock of the Peace Party. And I think a lot of people who went through that experience decided that's the side they wanted to be on. These mechanized or sort of impersonal wars that now slaughter huge swaths of people. I was trying to impress on my students the other day that if you look at it, we went from 62 million worldwide killed in World War II to 50,000 of our soldiers in Vietnam to maybe 3,000 in the current wars. It's a different ballgame. It's civilian deaths more than it is soldier deaths more and more. Very powerful stuff that's going to... Now, where will this be? Where?
The program for the World War I letters will be at Lansing City Hall on this Thursday evening. We will be at 7 o'clock. And not only will Mary Jane be sharing her letters, but we are encouraging other people who have letters that have been passed down in their families to bring them along and maybe consider reading one of those and sharing it with the crowd that night. And it doesn't have to be World War I. It doesn't have to be World War II. It could be Vietnam. It could be Korea. It could be something from one of the more recent conflicts. Letters are still a way that we stay tied together, and we'd like to have some folks share theirs with us.
Let's hope we never have to have emails from World War III. And I don't know
Amen to
how
that.
you're not going to have those artifacts, are you?
No, it won't happen anymore.
No.
It's over.
It's over.
I don't think people were recording their Skypes, probably. They may have been, which would be pretty moving at some point.
You'll have to pair this with protests from the Lansing goes to protest. That was another important part of it. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Wonderful program. Thursday night at the City Hall at
Thursday
7
night,
o'clock.
Lansing City Hall. There's more information on our website, which is lansinghistory.org. Also there you'll find information about the entire series of Civil War themed programs that we'll have in April, including the reading of the Civil War love letters, which will be on April 11th.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, and please keep us apprised of all the great work that your Historical Society is doing and all the upcoming events. Thank you to
Bonnie.
Valerie Marvin.
Always a pleasure.